Hello, everyone. Welcome to this final event of Pop Symposium. I'm so happy that we've survived these 5 days of hybrid events, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Suzanne Ciani to close the symposium this year. I am Symposium Director Peggy Hogan, and I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement. We at Pop Montreal would like to acknowledge that we are hosting this event from the unceded lands of Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. We urge everyone who attends the Funhouse event, the events of our week, to become informed about and involved in anti-colonial and Indigenous-led struggles and resistance wherever you may live. And we would also like to acknowledge the solidarity that exists between Indigenous resistance and Black liberation struggles, and that working toward decolonization includes supporting Black lives and Black liberation. I am going to briefly pass it off to our co-presenter on this event, Leticia from NVA. She is the music director of Never Apart, a fantastic DJ, an event organizer and coordinator, radio content maker, journalist, so many things. And she is going to intro our beloved guest today.
Hi, everyone. This is really thrilling. Suzanne Ciani is with us today, and I think a lot of you may know her work, but I'm going to introduce our wonderful guest. So Suzanne is really one of the first women to work in sound design in the early 70s and is a 5-time Grammy nominee recording artist. She's a trained pianist from UC Berkeley and really known for her work with the Buchla synthesizer. She also did soundtracks for movies like The Incredible Shrinking Woman. She's the voice behind the Xenon pinball machine. She did her infamous Coca-Cola pop and pour sound effect and many other things. So thank you, Suzanne, for being with us too. This is such an honor, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Leticia. It's wonderful to be here, and I can just feel the crowds, out there in space, someplace. So I'm glad we could all be together, even if it's a virtual togetherness, which is nice too. I guess it has double meaning. Virtuous, maybe.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm going to let you start with your presentation, and then at the end we'll have a question for a period for questions. So why don't you just go right into it?
Okay, so what I'm going to do is give you a little pathway through my life and to see how I got to where I am now. I don't often look back on my whole life to see if there's a thread of continuity, but I guess in preparation of this particular talk, I did start to notice that there was a continuity. So I'm doing a little show and tell. I'm going to share my screen here, and we're going to take a step through my life. Here we go. So now I am called the diva, the diode. This is something that just popped into being. So I didn't create that epithet, but it has followed me. I started out as a pianist. So I went to an all-girls school, Wellesley College, and majored in music. I was in love with the piano. I could not live without the piano. And all that was fine. But then a huge shift in my life occurred when I went from Boston area on the East Coast to the West Coast for graduate school. So I went to UC Berkeley to get a master's degree in music composition, and Berkeley was wild. It was, the free speech movement, the Vietnam War protests, everything. We were all hippies. My hair was long. I didn't wear shoes for 3 years. And it was just a complete shift, very liberating from what I knew. And it seems that it wasn't an odd thing for my musical life to shift as well. And that happened when I met Don Buchla. So here I am at Bukla's factory. Here is the group picture. So what happened was that when I finished graduate school, I determined that I was going to pursue the Bukla, the instrument, and I went to work for Don Bukla. So with my master's degree, I went to Bukla's factory and I soldered for $3 an hour. And we were making the 200 series that you see here. The 200 series became my total passionate instrument. Here I am on the floor next to Don. And the next thing that happened, well, let's look at one of Don's schematics here. So this is one of his hand-drawn schematics. I call Don Bukla the Leonardo da Vinci of analog music instrument design. He dedicated his entire life to designing these instruments and interfaces. And by the time I met him, which was in the late 70s, he had already evolved his concept of what these instruments were. And his vision was that it was, in fact, a performance instrument. So, as we know, electronic music instruments have had many expressions. Some of them were considered studio instruments. They were so big you couldn't get them out of the studio, they were fixed in there. But Don's idea was that a composer musician could go out into the world with a portable electronic music instrument and perform. I took this to heart. I was proselytized by him. I didn't know how challenging it was actually to perform this instrument, but I dedicated the next 10 years of my life to doing just that. I needed to make a living. I needed to buy a Bukla. So I had to get out of the $3 an hour job at Bukla's. And I started doing commercial work and going out into the world to look for opportunities to make money. I went to Los Angeles. I worked in the film business and television business. But the next big thing that happened to me was that I was invited to perform in New York City at the Bonino Gallery. So this was in 1974. I flew to New York on April 1st, April Fool's Day, 1974, and instantly fell in love with New York City. Just recently, we have unearthed a little piece of footage from this Bonino Gallery concert, my first quad concert in New York City. The quality is not terrific, but it is a document. And I'm going to play for you now a little piece of that performance. It was on the 200 series.
We've got to get this
Okay, so I think we're going to release that. I mean, nowadays we're so lucky because we can, doctor all of the problems that occurred in early audio. And this could be cleaned up and maybe sound a lot better. When I arrived in New York, and I did decide to stay there, It was like an instant sensation. The New York Times interviewed me just a month after I got there. And this is a picture from that New York Times Sunday uh, art section. Nobody knew really what these instruments were. So here I was immersed in a world of my own, which was a little bit alienating for me, and I adopted an attitude that I really did need to educate my public because I wanted to be able to share my love for this instrument. And so I was very patient. And anytime anybody asked anything, I would try to explain about the instrument. I settled into New York and the machine grew. So here it is in a new formation, larger but still portable. I had 4 large road cases and a cartage company that would follow me around from studio to studio. This was the bigger Buchla. There it is again. And I was still starving and got a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts, a composer grant. It wasn't very lucrative, but it helped, and they required me to write a paper. So in 1976, I wrote Report to National Endowment and documented my performance practices with the Buchla. Not that anybody understood or anybody cared, but I had to do this for the grant. And 40 years later, this became my so-called cookbook for getting back to the Buchla. So here we have on the left a basic performance patch. And this describes, how you set up a particular patch to give you options during performance. On the right, there are 4 sequences, 16 stage sequences. These are the same sequences that I use today. They are raw material. So it doesn't quite define anything specific, but these sequences represent a starting point for materials that you can then, through the beauty of this machine, you can improvise and transform and keep in motion the materials. This is one technique that I was so happy to rediscover. It has to do with the multiple arbitrary function generator. And I use this particular patch in my performances today. And it is called, there's a wave shape modulation that goes on randomly. So as a sequence is running through its constant repetition, if you can find a way to randomly alter that content, it's very much more interesting than just hearing something cycle. There are 2 alterations in this patch. One is wave shape and the other is transposition. So here you see on the top what happens when those wave shape changes from sine to sawtooth. You see those black notes? Those are random notes that become sawtooth because a voltage is applied to change the wave shape. And it's very musical and wonderful. And the lower bars, you see what happens when you also randomly apply octave transposition. So it creates a 3-dimensional hierarchical control of the content, and your ear starts to separate out contrapuntal lines that are constantly shifting. And it's also very economical because you can get the illusion of 2 or 3 lines going on at once when just one thing is happening. So all those years that I spent, immersed in the buchla, I did develop techniques that are generalized enough to really help me today when I've come back to a quite different machine, the 200E. New York loved me. I had the only buchla. I was making sounds, and I was hired by, I recreated the Star Wars sounds for the disco version of Star Wars. And that was a lot of fun. And then I did. In the late 70s, I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to design a logo sound for Coca-Cola. There's a long story behind that. They didn't exactly call me up and say, please come and do your magic. I had to knock on the door for almost 2 years, and it was grueling, but in the end it all worked out. And I guess you'd say that one of the constituents of my evolution has been stubbornness. Stubbornness really born by having a passion. Even if I couldn't get to that passion directly, my passion was the buchla. My passion was performing on the buchla. But there was no opening for that. And so I determined that I would record, but there was no opening for that. So I decided to make money and then self-produce my albums. So here's Coca-Cola, because this is fun, okay? This is the pop and pour sound as seen in a particular Coke commercial.
Coke adds life to everything that makes your living nice. Coca-Cola, keep the sun shining down on your parade. Coca-Cola, beat your drum now, sing my song. Coca-Cola, lose it alone. Coke adds life, everybody wants a little life. Coca-Cola, Coke adds life to everything that makes your living nice. Coca-Cola, you and me, reaching for some extra fun. Coca-Cola, we're gonna sing and we're gonna shout. Start all over when the stars come out. Coke adds life, everybody wants a little life. Coca-Cola.
Wow. Okay, so I have to say Coke did add life to my life. And 1980 became a really big year for me. So the royalties from the pop and pour sound were coming in. And then everything happened in 1980. I was hired to score a Hollywood film, The Incredible Shrinking Woman. As it turns out, I was the first woman to be hired to score a Hollywood feature. And later I found out that not another woman would be given this privilege for another 15 years. That's how closed Hollywood was to women. The only reason really that I did get hired was that women were in charge. So Lily Tomlin was the star, and Verna Fields, who had edited Jaws at Universal Pictures, became head of production, and she hired me. So now today, I think things are changing, and I'm very happy for that. Other things happened in 1980. So I was hired by Bally Pinball to produce a score, the sound, for the Xenon pinball game. It was documented on a television program by, it was Peter Ustinov narrated it. And it was quite exciting because technology then You know, technology is always evolving and changing and exciting, but this really was an exciting time. It was the first time that there was a chip that was available that could actually create and allow the sampling of a female voice. I was the first female voice in this chip, in the chip. And, you know, there are reasons for that. The female voice is a higher frequency. It requires more calculation than a male voice. And there had been one machine before that had a lower range voice. The voice was fun to do, but I really thought that my contribution happened on, you know, many levels, one of which was that I designed a composition that could be really played by the person playing the machine. So it was designed, the sound was designed to actually modularly work as the game progressed. I was inducted into the Pinball Hall of Fame a couple of years ago for this machine. So I'm really thrilled that it hasn't been lost, and a lot of kids grew up on the machine and it did make its mark. I don't own one myself. Let's see. The other thing that happened was that my company started to grow. So, you know, with my goal of actually doing an album, I started my business. Performing seemed quite impossible on a high scale. I was given the opportunity to perform at Lincoln Center, but they refused to put up the back speakers, the quadraphonic sound, and I refused to play because I need quadraphonic. That's my language. I did spend years trying to improve theaters, and that didn't work. And so my next, you know, approach was to record. And I started my company, Ciani Musica, so that I could move forward with my ambitions to make money to produce my own recordings. This is a little clip from Dave Letterman that came out that year. And, you know, again, this is interesting because you'll see that at this point, I had moved from the booklet towards many other machines, instruments. And part of that is because half of my booklet was stolen. And also because suddenly the world of electronic instrumentation was blowing up all over the world. The Japanese were in. You know, the technology advanced. The Prophet 5, which is what you'll see here, was the first polyphonic instrument, and Dave Smith is a big hero of mine. So in this program, I'm using the Prophet 5 and something that I call the voice box. So that configuration of rack mount instruments that you'll see in the cart beside the Prophet 5 was something that I developed to be able to process voices and also to be able to use my voice to control sound, because the voice gave much more dynamic than was available in the technology otherwise. We didn't even have velocity sensitivity at that time. So here's the little clip from David Letterman.
Gentlemen, this woman standing next to me is an electronic wizard. Tell them what we got here. This looks like just a normal keyboard, and then all of this other stuff appears to be computers.
This is a synthesizer. It's called a Prophet synthesizer. This is an arrangement of electronic gear that I call the voice box.
Hello. make the thing make noises for
Okay,
us. Now, first of all, why do you have this stuff? What do you do with this?
Well, this is how I make a living.
I mean, you don't go door to door saying, "I'll make you sound goofy."
Yeah, they call me.
They call you.
This is kind of a... That's kind of a syndrome sound.
A syndrome sound?
Syndrome.
Syndrome sound.
You've heard that?
Yeah.
Yeah, you've heard that in a lot of different things. Then there are more interesting things that I like.
You know, the one that starts and gets bigger and bigger?
I know. I had this here we go. Ready?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Are all of these sounds pre-recorded or made right there? Right.
That was so much fun. I think that in a sense, I didn't really want to go on the David Letterman show because it was a lot of work to get all my gear over there and do everything. But I made a deal because I had started my first album and I wanted to use that opportunity to get my music. I did all this commercial stuff, but my heart was in my pure artistic music. And so I had written a score for the session players, and I was going to play the first wave, my first composition, but they cut to commercial, so I never got to do that part of the deal. But in any case, my company grew, and I established my own studio, mostly with the money that I got from doing The Incredible Shrinking Woman. And I built up a home studio in my apartment and had my office separate uptown. So here I am in my studio, and one of the instruments that I added was the synclavier. The synclavier was designed, it was fully digital, and it was designed by New England Digital and cost, by the time you got what you needed, $200,000. So it was ridiculously expensive, but it did pay for itself because it allowed me to approach sound design in a very surgical way. So for instance, designing a sound for AT&T on the telephone and being able to filter out particular frequencies that would have triggered dialing had they been in the sound. So very refined operations could be done, and working within, say, the range of 1/3 of a second was very possible digitally. This is some of the, this was a brochure that my company put out with some of the jobs that we did. Coca-Cola, Excedrin, Pabst Blue Ribbon Beer, the Energizer, and Columbia Pictures, a logo for Columbia Pictures. So work was going very well. And let's see what happens next. Oh, yeah. Okay, so this is my living room at 40 Park Avenue. And my clients would have to take off their shoes when they came in. And you can see that the living room was just, wall to wall stuffed with instruments. This is my crew. So my working staff grew as the business grew. And my engineer is to my left there, Leslie Mona Matthews, and she was my right arm. I had Mitch Farber, who is my arranger, and Chris Nuzzi and Rob Zante, Lance Massey, Marina Balika, and Robert. And so they were all wonderful people to work with. A lot of the sessions were still done outside the studio if it involved overdubbing real instruments. And that became my specialty, was integrating other instruments with electronics. In those days, nobody really knew what electronics could do, and I would be hired to overdub, come in and do your magic. And I would say, but wait a minute, you didn't structure this in a way that I could find a space, and it doesn't work rhythmically, etc. So that was another reason I started my own company, was so I could take control of the production to really give electronics the space that it deserved. There's my engineer, Leslie Mona, and we're in an outside studio, probably working on the first album. So as time went on, my business grew, and I built a new studio, a big studio, an outside studio, outside of my living room in a separate location. And this is the main room. Uh, it was a very unorthodox design at the time. I had beautiful picture windows on one side. We used near field monitoring. It was a reversal because the control room had all the electronic instruments, and then the clients were in the glass enclosure in front of the console there to the right, and to the left was another enclosure for instrumental, acoustic instrument overdubbing. So all the wiring was under the floor and connected to Studio B, and MIDI was coming in, and everything was, connected. That voice box configuration became one of the centerpieces of this new studio design. And what it did was it gave the instrumentalist, the electronic musician, control over the processing. So in a traditional studio, the engineer had access to all the rack mount controls, the filtering and the delays and compression or whatever else was going on. And I really felt that was the domain of the electronic artist. And so I put that in a new configuration that was very easy to access. Lying on its back like that, you could easily play those rack mount instruments. So commercial work went on, and it was fun. And I devoted myself to commercials during the week so that I could start recording my albums on weekends. I'm going to play a couple of commercials for you that just represent typical types of things that I did then. This one is called the GE Beep commercial. It won lots of awards and became, uh, proliferated into many versions. There was Beep, the cousin of Beep, the nephew of Beep, etc. What it was that the new GE dishwasher made a beep sound. So technology was just beginning to enter the daily lives of people. Sounds in elevators, sounds in domestic appliances. And they came to me and said, could you recreate this beep sound? And I said, of course. And they wanted me to score the picture with just that beep. I said, people will go crazy if they hear just that beep for the whole commercial. We have to enliven it. We have to do something. And so I created a language of the little beep, and it's really quite adorable. And I'm going to play this for you now.
The GE 2500. It can do almost everything but talk.
GE, we bring good things to life.
Great. So the one thing I have to let you know, because I was working in, the dark ages, it was before computers and were used in production. And there was no way to lock the audio with the video except manually. So every single one of those beeps, which of course were synchronized to hit the little lights, had to be checked manually by starting the audio and the video. The video was on a 3/4-inch machine, the audio on a 24-track 2-inch tape. These had to be hand started so that they would synchronize. It was a lot of work, but it did work. Now I'd like to play another commercial that was typical of when my company was called to do sound, and it was for companies that were involved in technology. And Atari was just entering the world in the gaming world, and so we did a lovely, fun commercial for Atari, and I'll play that for you now.
Centipede, Ms. Pac-Man, Vanguard, and Galaxian. If you thought it was going to be just another summer, Atari is going to turn your head around.
The hot names, the hot games, the hot deals. Yeah, it's gonna be a hummer, 'cause nobody's harder than Atari this summer. Nobody's harder than Atari this summer. No!
So that was fun. So all of this commercial work went on during the week, and I was finally in a position to pay for the production of my first album. In those days, I had to use outside studios. I know this is a little confusing in the time frame because I started my album actually before I was able to build my home studio in my living room. So I had to pay for outside studios. My first album was called Seven Waves. And so what I did, it had taken years to get to the point of expressing my artistic electronic side. And by the time I really had the opportunity, everything had changed. It was no longer live buchla. By this time, I was going to do a studio album. This first album was pure electronic. It did use the buchla, especially on the waves. But it was really, you can read on the album liner notes all the different instruments. The album took me 2 years to make, and the technology was changing constantly. And so everything, all the instruments changed during those 2 years. And that was the nature of technology. So I had these recordings. But in those days, you needed to have a record deal. There were no CDs. You couldn't make CDs. You couldn't make LPs yourself. You had to have a label. So I went all over to find a record deal. I went to Europe. I thought maybe because Tangerine Dream had had some success there, that there would be an opening. No. I went through the United States. No. And finally, I had the revelation that I should go to Japan, which was a huge record market. And I got my first record deal. So this was great. That it's very funny because they put my name on Suzanne Ciani because that was the name on the contract. But whatever, this is my. I'm going to play you the first wave. Okay, so there were 7 waves. They really represented a synthesis of my classical background with my electronic language. I think that my loneliness in playing just the buchla was just overpowering. And when it came time to record my first album, I wanted to feel, I think, a little bit more accessible. So these pieces were really orchestrated. They were written, of course, with a lot of space for electronic improvisation. Here is the first wave. Ah, so relaxing, huh? So you can see that I'm a romantic, and that's what started to come out was my romantic. I call it my romantic feminine side, and technology was seen as a kind of abrasive, mechanistic, masculine thing. And to me, what I gravitated towards was the comfort of these machines, that you could depend on them, that they could play in a very slow rhythm that maybe humans could not do, that that beat was secure, that it would come, that you didn't have to worry. And that part of the electronic possibility was what I explored in these my first two albums particularly. So the waves have a very special place in my heart, and of course my record label is called Seventh Wave in honor of this album. I was able, after the Japanese deal, to get a deal in the United States at Atlantic Records. Ilhan Mimaraglu put out this record. I was surprised. And then I did a second album. So the second album, there's Takoro in Japan. He was my record executive there. The Velocity of Love. The Velocity of Love started out in the same musical, concept of waves. Uh, I call the compositions waves because they were really shaped like waves. They built to a climax and they receded. And I thought of that also as a very feminine construction. The energy system was different from the kind of pumping, iron male approach to technology. And this this particular album hit a nerve. The last piece that I recorded for this album was the title song called The Velocity of Love. Why that title? Because velocity was a new parameter in electronics. Before velocity, it didn't matter how hard you hit a key, you got the same response. But then, things got a little more refined and you could actually get expression, more expression out of your playing. Of course, I worked very hard to get expression in lots of tricky ways. And you could hear that in, the in Seven Waves. Uh, but the Velocity of Love, I I licensed to RCA Records. It came out, and that song, The Velocity of Love, hit radio like a brush fire. New Age was just starting to become conscious in the collective consciousness, and radio stations were just developing this new format. I didn't think of myself as New Age, but it certainly did fit in, and it actually helped to create that format. So here I had a radio hit on my hands with The Velocity of Love, and the guy that signed me was fired after 25 years, and RCA was sold to BMG, and I was crossed off the list. So that was a kind of, dead end there. But uh, today it's still a perennial, this song, and it is very romantic. I'm not going to play it for you now, but I'm sure a lot of you have heard it. The next evolutionary step, which might have been a step backwards, was that I signed a deal with Peter Baumann, who was from Tangerine Dream and had come to New York and wanted to start his own record label. And I said I would help him get started by, becoming an artist on his label. Up to that point, I had never signed a traditional record deal. I refused. My albums were my children, and I wasn't going to put them up for adoption. Peter was my buddy, and so I overlooked that. And then, as luck would have it, his label was bought, and then it was bought again. And now I have 5 albums on Sony that I hope to get back someday. But as I was working with Peter Bauman, he asked me to do a piano solo album. So I was so immersed in electronics, I thought this was a ridiculous idea. But I did go back to the piano and we recorded Pianissimo, and it was a big hit. So it was a very good selling album. And that was kind of like a shock to me, like, oh my God, the piano? Uh, because even though I was raised as a pianist and a classical pianist, I never used the traditional keyboard in my electronics because I didn't want people to see it as a keyboard instrument, because it wasn't. And that's a long story. But the putting the keyboard on the analog modular machine completely obliterated what the machine was about. It made people comfortable, that it looked familiar, but it took away the whole understanding of a whole new language of control voltage and how you perform, not with a keyboard, but with designing control voltages and interacting with them to mold your materials live. So I then, over my years at private music, my music became more and more acoustic until I landed really back at the piano. And I toured all over the world playing the piano for years, which was, I always said uh, that I would never go back to the piano. And then once I was back at the piano, I said I would never go back to the boucle. So I'm always wrong. But how did I go back to the boucle? What happened? Uh, a lot of things happened. First of all, here's where I was. These are my albums. Uh, that this is kind of a complete collection of the albums on. Well, they're the albums on my label, the ones that I control, not the private music albums. Oh, yes, they are. The private music albums are there. So my first two, Seven Waves, Velocity of Love. Then we have Private Neverland, History of My Heart, Pianissimo, Hotel Luna. By the time we get to Dream Suite on the lower left, that was orchestra and piano. And that was my exit album from private music. They really didn't want an orchestral album, and I used that album to establish my new record label, Seventh Wave. And then my releases on Seventh Wave were first the Dream Suite, recorded in Russia, Pianissimo 2, Suzanne, Ciani and the Wave Live, a Christmas compilation with other artists, Turning, Pianissimo 3, Meditations, Pure Romance, and my last studio album, Silver Ship. So all of that was, in the approach of that I had already established, going slightly more acoustic, but also involving electronics. Then what happened? Finders Keepers Records in Manchester, England, approached me. Andy Votel said, we'd like to release some of your never released early tracks. And I thought, well, who would want to listen to those? Because I'd spent my whole life doing these very expensive, high quality, spare nothing productions of the ultimate in technology and sound in these studio albums. And then he wanted to release things that I'd done in my garage in Berkeley. And I resisted. But then it occurred to me that, I really do need to transfer these tapes, because the oxide on those early recordings doesn't last forever. and you have maybe 30 years before they disintegrate. And so I started, out of my own self-preservation, a project to transfer some of those masters. Well, we call them masters, but they were just recordings and whatever was there. And Andy started to release these things. Now, by this time, I had established myself as a romantic pianist. That was my identity. And Andy started to release these early electronic things, and I thought, well, he's a small label in Manchester and nobody will know. But of course, that was not the case because of the internet. And my fans, when they saw a new release, say on Amazon by Andy, would say, "Oh, new Ciani album, wow!" And then they would give it, a one-star review and say, "What is this? This is not a Ciani album. What is this?" And I kind of like panicked. I thought, "Uh-oh, how can I separate these two worlds?" And I tried for a couple of years. I said, "Andy, just don't do any publicity. I need to keep this quiet. I can't, interrupt my fans with something they don't understand." Well, as we know now, that didn't happen. And it was an evolutionary process where I found that I had a new audience. My new audience was also open to, my pre-existing identity. And my old audience eventually learned to make the distinctions between what they liked and what they didn't like. And I think that, for me, this opportunity to come back to electronics was really spearheaded by Finders Keepers Records. They released Lixiviation, which was early electronic. Then they released Buchla Concerts 1975, concerts that I did on the 200. I didn't know at the time that there had been a renaissance of interest in analog modular instruments. But suddenly I realized that because I would go out to do things and meet all these new young fans. And I thought, oh my, I'm excited because I have a second chance to show the Buchla and what it was destined to do but never did. So, yes, Finders Keepers started to create an opening in this electronic world for me again, but also Don Buchla. When I came back to the West Coast in 1992, I reconnected with Don, and we became good friends again, mostly playing tennis. I never thought of myself as going back to the Buchla, but when I would go to meet him for tennis, I would see his studio and see all the designs he was working on, and it didn't even tempt me. But one day he called and he said, "Look, I'm going to sell my company. And if you've ever thought of getting back to the Buchla, now is the time. Because now I can actually, make you a deal on some modules. And if you don't do it now, you won't be able to do it." So I put together a system and, put it into my home studio and didn't warm up to it right away. Here I am a little later. I'm getting to know it. This is my West Coast studio on the ocean. I left New York City. And it took a while, took a couple of years before I really felt at home on the new machine. As I mentioned, I did consult my paper from 1976. I learned a lot from that. I had to adapt to a lot of the new modules. That module on the upper left is the new version of the multiple arbitrary function generator called a dual arbitrary function generator, and it wasn't as performable. So, my interest has always been live performance, and I see all these modules through the lens of that possibility. And I found that the 200E was not as performable as the 200 in many respects. But, gradually, I got back into the performance of these instruments, and I did do a concert in 2015. It was my first comeback concert in San Francisco, and I played live quadraphonic with the 200E, and this was later put out on vinyl. It's no longer available on vinyl because it was a limited edition. In order to release a quad vinyl, we had to include a decoder. So the quadraphonic sound was encoded into stereo. Then you took the two outputs from the stereo from your turntable, and you put them into this decoder and out into your quadraphonic system. This was an old technology. Quadraphonic LPs were around in the early 70s, but they did not catch on. So we are still in the moment now of rediscovering possibilities that did exist and weren't realized. And one of them is quadraphonic for the masses. We're getting there. So I'm going to play you a little piece of this recording. It sounds very different from my early Buchla recordings. One, because the filter was very different, and many of the other aspects that is a very refined conversation that we won't have right now. But here's a little bit from the live quadraphonic. So, what can I say? I got my feet wet. That concert actually was sponsored by Moog. They, when we first started out, Moog and Buchla were polar opposites, and I was fighting Moog my whole career because I felt that the addition of the traditional keyboard to the instrument really did take away the potential of understanding of what the instruments could do. But as time goes on, all these things shift. And I think, through our new existence in the cloud and internet, that we have a better conversation going. And Moog and Buchla became friends. They actually manufactured his piano bar and released that. And Moog invited me to play at Moog Fest. I played at the first Moog Fest, and I played the Buchla piano bar. And Moog has always had space for me to play the Buchla. So, it was a new world. And I played the Buchla in this performance, which was a warm-up to the Moog Fest that year, where I also played the Buchla. So Moog has become a real, good part of my life now. And I thank them for initiating this new epic that's been going on in my life now, which is live performance with the Buchla 200E. Another reason that I decided to go out and play around the world was that Don Buchla died. So here he was, this, the Leonardo da Vinci of instrument design. And I just felt kind of like a special mission to show what it was that it was all about the first time around, where there was a vision for all of this. And so I hit the road, and I'm going to play you a couple of selections that I happen to have of concerts. This first one is from Sweden. Oh, first I have to mention that A Life in Waves was a documentary about my life that was made. I guess it was released in 2017. And that was a surprise to me. I was contacted by two young filmmakers who did a Kickstarter and did a wonderful job on the film. So that is available to see, I guess, on Amazon Prime and just about any place. And they really did a great job. Here is, okay, this was in Stockholm in 2017, and the engineer had mounted a camera on the Buchla so you can see part of it. So, yeah, I mean, one thing to notice about that is that the top panel there that I'm playing is the Marf. So the Marf was part of the 200 series. And I had a clone made to replace the DARF, which was that elliptical thing that you saw in the other picture. So I also had a clone made of the filter. So I, gradually started to find what I wanted in the system. This is a picture of performing at Red Bull in the 200E. This is in Italy at an outdoor festival called Terraforma. Again, I have all these kids now in my audience, which is kind of fun for me. And this is something that I did at Royal Albert Hall in London and in quadraphonic. And let's see what that sounds like. Great. Whoops. So now we're coming to the end here, and I just released. I have trouble releasing because my work is in quad. So on my own label, Atmospheric, I haven't been releasing. I've allowed third-party releases of a few things. on stereo, but it's against my principles to release in stereo. So this is a digital release so far, because in digital I can release in quadraphonic. There are also ambisonic mixes and stereo mixes available, but I released this on my atmospheric label, and it is available. You can download lots of high quality files, 88.2 and 24-bit and so forth. And we're hoping to make a quad LP again, exploring, what is available now for decoding, because the world is getting more spatial, and maybe we can take advantage of that in place spatial audio and find a way to integrate with it. So I'm going to play you a little bit. This is one of my last concerts before lockdown. So I played in Geneva and at Antigel Festival. And this is called Improvisation on 4 Sequences. And remember, those are the 4 sequences that were in the cookbook paper. So this is a part of that concert. Okay. Great. So that's my show and tell. And the artwork, by the way, was done by my sister, Mary. So my oldest sister, I have 4, is an artist, and she is amazing. And she's been painting since she was a little girl. And I'm going to be using her artwork for the covers of my releases once I figure out how to do them in quad. Good. So thank you. Thank you for watching. So do we still have some time? Oh my God, did I go way over? I
You went
did.
way over, but that was amazing. And we absolutely, that was amazing. Thank you so much, Suzanne.
Thank you.
What I really love about this is that it was just such a nice kind of story, right? The way that you told the story and all those brilliant photographs that are so wonderful. And what I really think that is so precious and key with your voice and having someone like you who's been really along the electronic sort of history, along the history in so many key points, and still, today involved in such, interesting and advanced work, is that you kind of have been there along the way, and you've seen all the technologies and all the changes and have really experimented. So I think that's really, really wonderful. And I have one question for you. That would be because you really covered a lot of the things that I was thinking of asking you. So my question is kind of around technology and kind of how what is it today? Looking back with all the things that you've adopted or maybe left along the way, what are some of the technologies that are available today that really spark something for you, that kind of work with your process, that have gotten you excited about what's happening now?
I've always felt that this field is a collaborative field. So as an artist and as a performer, you use the tools that are designed by the designers. And technology is, an ever morphing area. So things change all the time. What I'd like to see happen now is in the area of instrument design. I'm so excited that, the kids are back out performing, that they're playing modular, that they're playing without the keyboards, that they are using control voltage and all kinds of, input systems. But what I'd like to see more of is an acknowledgement of spatial movement in a very sophisticated way. So not just a joystick where you can move things, in one way or another, but you need voltage controlled movement that allows integration of rhythm and movement generated by the music itself. It's not a post-production thing that you add space afterwards. You generate the space at the time. And I have seen modules that address that. The other thing I would like to see is this MARF. I'm working on a design with Buchla Company, but I'd like to see this just, out there. It's a higher level of control of materials. So we still need to pay attention. And the other thing that I'd like to see more of in the world of performance is more feedback in the instruments. Because when you're playing, you need to know what's going on inside. Buchla always had that down cold. He had all the lights. He had the distinction of, cables and color coding and all kinds of things that allowed the performer to respond. So those are the things I'd like to see happen.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here with us. I really enjoyed this time with you, and I think everyone really, really did too. And thank you for sharing all of this with us today. I've been a fan for a while, and it's really nice to be able to chat.
Thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm sorry I went so far over. I just assumed that, I didn't see the clock. My computer didn't have a clock. So anyway, thank you. All right. Take care, Leticia. Thank you.
And thanks to Pub Montreal for inviting Everpart to be part of this as well. and to everyone watching, thank you so much. And keep the music coming, Suzanne. We love it.
Good. Okay, there'll be more. Okay, merci bien. Je sais que tu parles